This is another addition to the ongoing mini-series called Localhost 1000, where I'm documenting the process of building web apps and sharing the things I learned along the way. So last video, I briefly mentioned the fact that one of the choices you have to make when building a full stack application is, should you choose client-side rendering versus server-side rendering? In short, CSR versus SSR. I actually didn't go online and learn about this topic. I kind of stumbled into this while I was building my application apexplayground.com. So this is why I think this is an interesting topic to share. So if you have not watched my previous videos, I built and launched an app called apexplayground.com, which is essentially a lead code for Salesforce developers to practice programming in Apex, a backend language that's used in Salesforce. It is online now. You can go check out the app and try it out. I did not get many user signups through YouTube, even though my past two videos did relatively well. It's mainly because it's such a niche app. It's mainly focused on Salesforce developers, and I don't even know how many of you guys watching here are even working with Salesforce. So it was kind of expected. It is by design. But I cross-promoted this app at work and this Salesforce conference that happened in Prague last week, and I got a reasonable number of signups. Last night when I checked, I had somewhere between 20 to 30 user signups, and some of the people have promised me to give a shout out on their online blogs so that I can get a few more traffic and users signed up. So I want to explain this topic purely based on my experience building this application, and at the end of the video, I want to walk you through my code base and show you how client-side rendering and server-side rendering works in action. Client-side rendering basically means your website is dynamically rendered directly in the browser, which means each action or interaction as a user on the website does not require a backend request or a server request. I will show you this in action later on in the demo. When you visit a website that is client-side rendered, you will see in the browser, the server gives you an HTML file with minimal content and references to the JavaScript files, and the browser then later on downloads the scripts and runs them dynamically. So there are both pros and cons to this approach. Some of the advantages of using client-side rendering is rich user experience. This goes back to the point that we mentioned earlier, where each interaction or action of the user on your app does not need to make a server request. So it feels much more faster and it's more dynamic. And it also gives you another advantage, which is faster subsequent page loads, since on the initial load, it loads all the basic JavaScript files, and navigating through your application from one page to another is much more faster. And one of the main advantage of client-side rendering is scalability. So when your application is client-side rendered, that also means you also have a server or your backend hosted on another server. This basically lets you distribute your traffic or your server load to both client side and server side. So you're distributing all your rendering work to user devices as opposed to making a server side call. So when you're talking scalability, I'm talking maybe 6-digit users or 7-digit users, because a lot of indie hackers that I follow on Twitter on the tech space all have users from somewhere between the scale of 5-digit to 6-digit, and most of them are using all the modern tools like Next.js, SweaterKit, or Nuxt.js for server-side rendering their apps, and I don't see anyone complaining about any scalability issues. So just because scalability is one of the advantages doesn't mean you have to jump on client-side rendering your applications. So it's really up to the use case of what your app is for. Like anything, there are also cons to client-side rendering, one of them being SEO limitation. Since all the content is loaded as a JavaScript file, it's hard for search engine crawlers to index your website or your web application. So SEO is at loss here. And the second disadvantage here is initial load time. Since it's loading all the basic JavaScript file at once on the initial load, the initial load of your website or your application is way longer. And the third one is browser dependency. Since everyone uses their own browser of choice, you cannot always promise how the application works on each user's device. In simple terms, server-side rendering means exactly what it says. So the backend server generates a complete HTML and serves it to the client-side browser. So when the user or client loads your web application, they get served with a fully rendered HTML page from the start. So there are pros and cons to these approach too. So some of the pros are security. Since the server handles all the rendering, you can do better authentication. The second one being compatibility. So server-side rendering means you can to an extent promise your users consistent behavior across devices because it's not dependent upon what device or browser they're using, because it's all rendered on your server. You can to an extent offer consistent behavior on all devices. And it also means regardless of a user's machine, how old it is, you can have a graceful degradation on how your app works. And one other advantage is that you can do caching. So if a user revisits your application, you can cache what's already loaded instead of making a new server request. I think this is the most highlighted pro of SSR these days, is that there are a lot of tools and frameworks to build SSR application. The most popular one being Next.js, and there's an alternative Next.js, and there is SweaterKit for people who want to write PHP code. A lot of the indie developers are going the server-side route and building applications that makes 5 figures, 6 figures. So I think with the tooling that we have now, server-side rendering outweighs its cons in a lot of ways. But that is not to say that server-side rendering has its own disadvantages. The number one being scalability, as we mentioned before. Since all the request is handled by one server, it's high likely that it can take a hit. And the second one being less dynamic, which I don't think is really true at this day to age. It really depends on your application, where we mentioned that each interaction or action of the user requires a server-side request, which can make your application look a bit laggy and less dynamic. But it really depends what kind of application you're building. Now I want to jump into my code base and show you how client-side rendering and server-side rendering works in action. So over here I have my project open. I'm just going to zoom this in a bit. So you can see my project structure. Server, I have a server folder and a client folder. Client is basically my front end and server is basically my backend. I also have 3 different terminals open here, one for my client front end and one for my server, and one for the main directory, which is the prod. I'm not doing anything there. So you can see here my client or my front end runs on localhost 5173. It's such an odd number that Weether gives, I didn't bother to change it. And my backend runs on 1001. So the key here is when you're doing a client-side rendering, the key differentiation here is to understand that you're running 2 servers, one for your front end and one for your backend. So each time you're making a request, you're making a request from your front end server to your backend server. I want to show this in action. So if you go into your Weether config file here, you can see that I'm pointing my target to my backend. So my proxy goes into my backend here, which is hosted on 1001, right? So each of the requests is routed to my backend and my front end is hosted on 5173. If I go in, I have logs open here. So each time I make a request to backend, I should be getting logs here. So I want to show that in action. So you can see here, some of them is from my past logs. Here, if I go into localhost 5173, here what I'm seeing here is something that is rendering from my front end server, which is 5173. So at this point, my backend has no interaction at all, which is my backend server 1001. So each time someone makes a request on my application, it should get routed to my backend. If I were to sign in, it should go into my backend. Before that, I just want to show you my UI. Actually, I changed this bit since I made my last video. So I have a landing page here with sign in. I have a dragger here, which shows you how painful it is to actually code inside the developer console in Salesforce. And I'm just showing how easy it should be developing in an inbuilt editor. And I have a bit of design going on here. Your playground to practice Apex. This is a character from Salesforce avatars. It's called Ruth. And I have a nice footer here. Yeah, that's a quick demo of my UI. So if I make a request to sign in, I will come back here. You can see there are two different GET requests on my backend. One for authenticating, which is when I try to sign in, and the other one is when it got connected to database. Each interaction on the front end goes to your backend as a request. So if I were to sign in using one of the saved user, I can sign in, I can solve a challenge if I hit submit code, missing return statement. So you can see all of the logs is coming here on the backend server because each request is routed to our backend, right? But in simply put, let me try to log out and I'll show you one last thing. If I hit log out, you can see I'm destroying the session with my logout, and you can see the log is coming from my Salesforce middleware for logging out and having all the authentication for Salesforce. So I logged out. So each request again coming to backend. But simple interactions on the front end, for example, I just want to move to a different page, right? So I want to hit get started. So it shows you a list of all the problems that I have here. And if you go back to my backend logs here, you see there's no request that's coming to my backend because it's purely an interaction that's happening on the front end when you're doing client-side rendering. Unless you're doing an action that requires your backend, you don't need to call your backend. You can simply route something or do some dynamic actions on your front end without having to rely on a server request to your backend. So that is the key here. This is basically client-side rendering. Now I want to show you how server-side rendering works. Now for server-side rendering, you only need one server. That means you're only deploying your backend, and your backend just serves your front end as static files. Let's see how that works in action. So what I'm gonna first do here is, we don't need this proxy, it doesn't matter. We need to set this up as to our backend, so we do need this proxy. What I initially need to do is I'm gonna kill the server here, and we need to npm run build so that we can get the build file of our front end and put it into our backend folder structure so that we can serve it as a static file. So let me show you that. If I run npm run build, it's gonna create a build file in my front end. You can just see it created a new folder here called this, which has all the assets of my front end. So what I'm basically gonna do is serve that front end into my backend here. So I have my dist essentially serving here. So now I don't need my front end. So you can see here, I'm not running any front end server. It's completely killed. It's not running. So if I go into my backend is still running, but we need to make a small modification here. So the first one being, if I go into my index.file in my backend express server, I need to serve my dist folder or my static front-end files whenever someone is making a request, right? So I need express static this line over here, which says serve this file, this folder. And then I also need this here when I say that any other request other than to API should be routed to my dist folder, which is basically means any other routes that does not include /API means it's a front-end route, it's not a back-end route. So server's up and running. Let's see if it works. Hopefully I didn't make any mistake. I think there should be a mistake here. So every time someone is authenticated, I am forwarding them back to redirecting them to the front end. So in this case, we do not have a server anymore on 5173. Instead, we are just routing them to our static file. So we cannot redirect like this. We just simply need to redirect to a route that's existing on our same server. So we don't have an endpoint per se for the front end. With this change, everything else should be working. And one other major change you will notice here is, like, if I run this 5173, which was previously where my front end was hosted, it should not give me any results. You can say site cannot be reached. But if I go to localhost 1001, it should give me the new front end, which is actually getting served from my backend. So here, as we mentioned already, I don't have any front end running. So this is purely getting served from my backend, which is on localhost 1001, which is my server. So every interaction should just work exactly the same way as before. But instead of making a request from front end to backend, this is now just serving it from our backend server. So let me try to sign in, same as before. Let me go into one of my saved usernames, login, and it should get routed to our front end. So basically, previously we had a routing. If you go back here, you can see there's 5173 slash problems. That means I was going into a route that is on my front end server, but this time you're going into a route that is on your front end, but the route is actually going from your backend, which is 1001. This is essentially the core concept of server-side rendering versus client-side rendering. So now on server-side rendering, I'm just serving each of my files as a static file to the front end, but everything should work as it is. So if I hit submit, I should get an error message, which should work. So all the request is handled here on the backend. So this is just the basic concept of client-side rendering versus server-side rendering. So like I mentioned before, if you're not building the next Facebook or the next Instagram or the next big thing, I don't think this is a choice that should hold you back at this point. Because most of the apps, most of the indie developers these days, like I mentioned before, are using server-side rendering. And I'm not saying do not build your app with scalability in mind, but I'm saying if you want to ship things faster, server-side rendering is much more convenient, because I went down the rabbit hole of building my app initially using client-side rendering, and I had a lot of bugs, mainly the course error that you need to fix. Even though you fix your course error on your local, when it goes to production, you again get those errors and you have to debug those. It's just painful. So if convenience and speed to market is key, I would say go with the server-side rendering route. And in the future, if you get to a point where your application has a bottleneck of scalability because you're doing server-side rendering, then you can always rewrite your app to be client-side rendered. I would say that is a problem that I would like to have at some point, because I have that many users and that many traffic coming in that I cannot scale my app anymore. So I need to switch the rendering technique. So that is a good problem to have, but initially do not get caught up on this decision. I would say just go with server-side rendering. Like I mentioned, there are plenty of tools and frameworks out there that's going to help you build your apps faster. I hope all of this made sense. It's a technical concept which really gives you an idea of how web application works. It was really nice when I learned this concept initially when I was building the app. Go watch my first two videos where I came up with the idea and built a scrappy MVP and took that scrappy MVP to production. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have been, thanks for watching.